France came to Kenya with smiles, speeches, investment promises, and the language of partnership. But behind the polished stage in Nairobi, there was a deeper story. A wounded European power trying to find its way back into Africa after being pushed out of the Sahel. For years, France behaved like Africa was still its backyard. It had military bases, political networks, business interests, mining influence, currency links, and old colonial relationships across West and Central Africa. But that old system is now shaking. In Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, France has been rejected by military governments and by many young Africans who see Paris not as a partner, but as a symbol of control. At the center of this new wave is Burkina Faso's leader, Ibrahim Traoré. To many supporters, Traoré represents a new African defiance. He is young, direct, military-minded, and openly anti-imperialist. His government ended the military agreement that allowed French troops to operate in Burkina Faso, and France later withdrew its forces after being asked to leave. Reuters reported in January 2023 that France agreed to withdraw its troops from Burkina Faso within a month after the junta asked it to go. That moment was more than a military decision, it was a humiliation for France. For Paris, Burkina Faso was not just another country. It was part of the old French sphere in Africa. It was part of a region where France once believed it had deep influence. But under Traoré, Burkina Faso sent a message: African security should not depend on French soldiers, French approval, or French permission. That message spread. Mali had already pushed France away. Niger followed after its coup. Senegal also moved toward ending France's military presence. The Guardian reported that France's Kenya summit came after withdrawals from Mali, Niger, and Chad, and amid rising anti-French sentiment in former French spheres of influence. So, when French President Emmanuel Macron arrived in Nairobi for the Africa Forward Summit, this was not just a normal diplomatic trip, it looked like a rescue mission for French influence. France had lost face in the Sahel. Now it needed a new door into Africa. Kenya became that door. Kenyan President William Ruto gave France what the Sahel refused to give: a stage, legitimacy, and a warm diplomatic welcome. Nairobi became the place where France tried to tell Africa, we are different now. We are not here to dominate. We are here to invest. At the summit, Macron announced a huge investment package. The Associated Press reported that France unveiled a €23 billion, or about $27 billion, investment initiative for Africa, targeting areas such as energy, artificial intelligence, agriculture, health, and infrastructure. To France, this was supposed to look like a new beginning. To its critics, it looked like desperation. The message from Paris was clear: if the Sahel has closed the door, France will knock on Kenya's door. If Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger no longer want French soldiers, France will come back through business deals, climate finance, technology, trade, youth events, and big summits. That is why the Nairobi summit mattered. It was not only about money, it was about survival. France fears losing Africa completely. It fears that the anger that started in the Sahel could become a continental mood. It fears that leaders like Ibrahim Traoré could become symbols for young Africans in countries far beyond Burkina Faso. It fears that one day, crowds in Nairobi, Dakar, Abidjan, Kinshasa, and Yaoundé may all speak the same language: Africa first, France out. That fear is not imaginary. It was already visible in Kenya. During the summit, protests happened in Nairobi against what activists called French imperialism. Nation Africa reported that about 50 activists, including foreign nationals, were arrested near the summit venue with placards denouncing French imperialism. The East African also reported that protesters linked to the Communist Party of Kenya attempted to demonstrate against alleged French imperialism, but security forces stopped them. That means France came to Kenya to rebuild influence, but it also brought the anti-France debate with it. In one scene, Macron and Ruto stood together, speaking about investment, partnership, and Africa's future. In another, protesters outside were saying the old empire had simply changed clothes. This is the contradiction. France says it wants a new relationship with Africa, but many Africans remember the old one. They remember colonial rule. They remember forced labor, resource extraction, political interference, and military control. They remember how African wealth often moved outward, while African people remained poor. They remember uranium, gold, oil, cocoa, strategic minerals, ports, bases, and contracts. They remember how France built influence not only through flags and armies, but also through banks, companies, language, culture, and elites. One of the biggest symbols of this old system is the CFA franc, a currency used by several former French colonies. Critics have long described it as a tool that kept African economies tied to France after independence. The London School of Economics published analysis describing the CFA franc as French monetary imperialism, while noting that France and some African leaders defend it as a stabilizing African currency. This is why many Africans do not trust French speeches about equality. They ask, if France loved Africa so much, why did Africa remain poor while French companies gained access to African resources? Why did France support certain African leaders for decades while ordinary people struggled? Why did France stay so close to African armies, presidents, and currencies after independence? Why did partnership often feel like control? This is the history Macron is trying to escape. In Nairobi, he tried to present France as a modern partner. He spoke of investment, innovation, and sovereignty. Ruto also used the summit to speak about a new Africa that does not want aid, but fair investment and fair treatment in the global financial system. Reuters reported that African leaders at the Nairobi summit pushed for credit reforms, arguing that Africa is punished by unfair risk perceptions and high borrowing costs. On paper, that sounds good. But politics is not only about what is written on paper, it is also about memory, emotion, and power. For many young Africans watching from Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and beyond, the question was simple. Why is Ruto helping France come back at the same time the Sahel is pushing France out? This is where Ibrahim Traoré enters the story again. Traore has built his image around sovereignty. His supporters see him as a leader who refuses to bow. So when he sees France being welcomed in Kenya, he may feel that Africa is being divided. One side is saying, France out. Another side is saying, France, come invest. Of course, there is no public proof that Traore personally feels betrayed by Ruto, but politically, the image is powerful. In the imagination of many Pan-African supporters, Traore may look at Nairobi and think, we are fighting to close the old colonial door, while others are opening a new entrance. That is the emotional center of this story. France is not only trying to win contracts, it is trying to stop the Traore message from spreading. Because if Traore becomes more than a national leader, if he becomes a continental symbol, France's problem becomes much bigger. It will no longer be about one military base in Burkina Faso. It will be about millions of young Africans questioning the entire French presence on the continent. That is why Kenya is important. Kenya is not a former French colony. It is English-speaking. It has strong links with the West, but also with China, the Gulf, and other global powers. It is a diplomatic hub. It hosts the United Nations offices in Nairobi. It has a major technology sector, a strong business class, and a president who wants to present himself as a continental deal-maker. For France, Ruto is a lifeline. He gives France a chance to say, look, Africa has not rejected us. The Sahel is not all of Africa. Kenya is with us. Many African leaders are still ready to talk. That is why the summit was held in Nairobi. Reuters reported before the summit that France, shorn of influence in former West African colonies, was seeking to deepen ties elsewhere on the continent, with Kenya hosting the first such summit in an English-speaking African country. This was France's new strategy. When the old Francophone house burns, build a new house in Anglophone Africa. But the problem for France is that the African street is changing faster than the diplomatic stage. In the past, France could depend on presidents, ministers, and military agreements. Today, it must also face TikTok, X, YouTube, student movements, Pan-African activists, and young voters who are less afraid to speak openly against Europe. The old closed-door diplomacy is being challenged by a loud public conversation. That conversation followed Macron to Nairobi. Then came the moment that made things worse. At the University of Nairobi, Macron interrupted a panel and scolded a noisy audience, calling the disruption disrespectful. The Associated Press reported that the moment created backlash, with critics saying his tone looked patronizing or colonial, especially after he had tried to present himself as supportive of Pan-Africanism. For his supporters, Macron was simply asking for respect during a serious discussion. But for critics, the image was damaging. A French president standing in an African university, raising his voice and telling Africans how to behave. That scene gave anti-France voices exactly what they needed. It was almost like a symbol of the whole relationship. France says it wants a partnership of equals, but when things become uncomfortable, it still sounds like the old master in the room. This is why France's comeback plan is so fragile. Money alone cannot fix humiliation. Investment alone cannot erase colonial memory. A summit cannot rebuild trust if people feel the attitude has not changed. France now faces two Africas. The first Africa is the Africa of state houses, investment forums, handshakes, and summit photos. This is the Africa where leaders sit with Macron, talk about finance, sign deals, and welcome French companies. The second Africa is the Africa of angry youth, Pan-African activists, Sahel soldiers, unemployed graduates, online commentators, and protesters in the streets. This Africa does not want speeches about partnership. It wants control over minerals, currencies, borders, armies, and political decisions. Ruto is speaking to the first Africa. Traore is inspiring the second. That is why the France-Kenya summit feels bigger than Kenya. It is part of a continental argument over what African sovereignty should mean. Should Africa work with France if the terms are better? Or should Africa first break the old chains completely before talking about new deals? Should leaders welcome France for investment or reject it because of history? Can France ever be a fair partner, or is it only trying to rebrand old influence? These are the questions that now follow every French move in Africa. France says it has learned lessons, but African critics say France is only changing strategy because it has been forced to. They argue that Paris did not suddenly discover respect for Africa. It discovered fear after being kicked out of the Sahel. That is why desperation is the word many critics use. France is desperate for markets, desperate for minerals, desperate for diplomatic relevance, desperate to compete with China, Russia, Turkey, the Gulf states, and the United States. Desperate to show that it still matters in Africa after losing military ground in West Africa. Africa is not just emotional history for France, it is strategic power. Without Africa, France becomes smaller in the world. Its global voice weakens, its companies lose opportunities, its military reach shrinks, its claim to be a major world power becomes harder to defend. That is why France cannot simply walk away. It needs Africa more than it admits. This is also why the Sahel rejection hurt so deeply. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger did not just remove French troops, they damaged the myth that France was still an unavoidable power in Africa. They showed that an African government could say no and survive. They showed that French influence was not permanent. Ibrahim Traoré became part of that message. In Burkina Faso, his supporters view him as a man who stood up when others were silent. They see him as proof that Africa can remove foreign influence, take control of its security, and speak with pride. His critics, of course, point to the dangers of military rule, lack of elections, and worsening security threats. But symbolism matters, and Traoré's symbol is powerful. For France, that symbol is dangerous. A young African leader in military uniform saying no to Paris is more powerful than a long policy paper. It travels faster. It becomes a meme, a slogan, a poster, a song, a speech, a dream. That is what France fears. Not only Traoré the president, Traoré the idea that Africa does not need French permission, the idea that old powers can be expelled, the idea that natural resources should first serve African people, the idea that military agreements with former colonizers are not destiny, the idea that African unity can be built around resistance. If that idea spreads, France's new Nairobi strategy may collapse before it grows. This is why Ruto's role is controversial. To his supporters, Ruto is being practical. Kenya needs investment. Africa needs capital. France has money, companies, and technology. Kenya can use France without being controlled by France. In this view, diplomacy is not betrayal, it is strategy. But to his critics, Ruto is giving France a soft landing after the Sahel humiliation. They see him as helping Paris clean its image. They believe Kenya is being used as a new platform for French influence at the exact moment when Pan-African movements are trying to weaken that influence. This is the political drama. In one possible future, France uses Kenya as a new base for influence. French companies enter more African markets. Macron or his successors talk less about soldiers and more about investment. Paris builds ties with English-speaking Africa and tries to move beyond the damaged Francophone relationship. In another possible future, the Nairobi summit backfires. The protests grow. Young Africans ask why France is suddenly so generous after losing the Sahel. More people compare Ruto's welcome with Traore's rejection. The summit becomes not a comeback, but a reminder of how unwanted France has become. Imagine the scene. In Nairobi, the conference lights shine. Macron speaks about partnership. Ruto nods and talks about investment. Cameras flash. Delegates clap. French officials smile because, for a moment, France looks welcome again. But outside, young protesters raise placards against imperialism. Online, clips spread across Africa. In Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, people watch and say, "We removed them and now they are trying to return through Kenya." In that imagined moment, Traore does not need to say a word. His silence becomes political. His earlier actions speak louder than the summit speeches. That is how France's problem grows. Every handshake with an African president now has to compete with the image of French troops leaving the Sahel. Every investment promise has to compete with the memory of colonial extraction. Every speech about equality has to compete with the accusation that France only respects Africa when Africa resists. France may regret not changing earlier. It may regret treating African anger as noise for too long. It may regret thinking military bases were enough to protect influence. It may regret supporting old political systems that younger Africans now reject. It may regret taking African patience for granted. Because now the mood has changed. Africa is no longer accepting old language easily. Words like partnership and cooperation are being questioned. People want to know who owns the minerals, who controls the currency, who signs the contracts, who benefits from the ports, who gets the jobs, who controls the army, and who really makes the decisions. This is why France's Nairobi move is risky. If it offers real respect, fair deals, and no interference, it may rebuild some trust. But if it only uses Kenya to replace what it lost in the Sahel, the backlash may become even stronger. The France-Africa relationship is now standing at a crossroads. On one road is the old France. Military bases, elite networks, resource access, political influence, and speeches about friendship, while African anger grows. On the other road is a new relationship. If France is truly ready for it, no arrogance, no hidden control, no exploitation, no treating Africa as a junior partner, and no pretending that history does not matter. But the question is whether France can really change. Many Africans are not convinced. For them, the Nairobi summit did not prove France has changed. It proved France is afraid. Afraid of losing Africa, afraid of China and Russia gaining space, afraid of Pan-African unity, afraid of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré becoming continental symbols, afraid that one day the message from the Sahel will become the message of Africa. That is why the title of this moment could be simple. France lost the Sahel, now it is turning to Kenya. But the deeper story is even bigger. France is not just looking for influence, it is looking for a way back into an Africa that is no longer willing to be treated like the Africa of yesterday.